For centuries, we have been told that success, health, and transformation are matters of willpower, that we must summon an invisible force within ourselves and push relentlessly against the inertia of our habits. It's an appealing story because it simplifies the complexity of human behavior into a single measurable trait: determination. Yet, modern neuroscience and psychology paint a far more nuanced picture. Willpower is not an endless reservoir, it is a finite resource, bound by the biology of the human brain. Every act of self-control draws on a limited supply of cognitive energy, and when that supply is depleted, even the strongest intentions can falter. This is not a failure of character but a reflection of the fundamental design of our minds. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of decision-making and self-regulation, requires glucose and oxygen to operate optimally, and it cannot function in isolation. When we rely solely on willpower to resist impulses, skip meals, or force ourselves through fatigue, we are essentially asking our biological machinery to operate beyond its sustainable limits. Yet, if willpower is finite, we are not doomed to constant struggle. There exists a far more elegant approach rooted in understanding the signals that our bodies and environments provide. The human organism is exquisitely sensitive to cues, both internal and external, that guide behavior naturally. Light, for example, is a powerful regulator of circadian rhythms. The presence of sunlight in the morning signals to the brain that it is time to be alert, to metabolize energy, and to prepare for activity. In contrast, dimming light in the evening triggers melatonin production, preparing the body for rest. Similarly, the body's hunger signals are not arbitrary, they reflect fluctuating levels of hormones like ghrelin and leptin, chemical messengers that communicate energy needs. When we attune ourselves to these signals, we are no longer in constant conflict with our physiology. Instead of demanding ourselves to ignore hunger or push past fatigue through sheer determination, we learn to respond intelligently, in harmony with the biological cues already present. The concept extends to habits as well. Willpower often fails not because we lack strength but because the environment is saturated with conflicting signals. The brain is constantly scanning for cues that have historically predicted reward or danger. A plate of food within arm's reach, the ping of a notification, or the sight of a comfortable couch are all interpreted by neural circuits as opportunities for immediate satisfaction. When the environment is structured in a way that constantly triggers these circuits, reliance on willpower alone becomes a near impossible task. But when we begin to curate our surroundings, placing nutritious food within easy reach, dimming distracting lights, scheduling movement at natural peaks of energy, we harness the same neural pathways without exhausting the prefrontal cortex. Change no longer demands relentless effort, it emerges from an alignment between intention and signal, a subtle dialogue between biology and environment. This approach also deepens our understanding of human motivation. Motivation is often framed as a force we must generate internally, yet the body constantly signals readiness and need through hormones, neurotransmitters, and neural feedback loops. Dopamine, for example, is not simply a reward chemical but a messenger that signals opportunity, learning, and progress. By recognizing the moments when the body is primed for action, when attention is high, energy is available, and mood is conducive, we can act in ways that feel effortless rather than forced. This is not a surrender of discipline but a recalibration, an acknowledgement that human biology is designed not for constant conflict but for adaptive response. The science becomes philosophy when we consider what it means to live in harmony with our own signals. The relentless culture of push harder ignores the subtle intelligence built into our physiology. Each heartbeat, each surge of energy, each moment of fatigue is a message, a signal encoded by evolution to optimize survival, growth, and well-being. By listening to these cues, by adjusting our environment and routines to support them, we transform the struggle of willpower into a partnership with our own biology. Habits are often described as the building blocks of human behavior, small routines that define the rhythm of our lives. Yet for many, habits feel like a mystery, emerging seemingly at random, slipping away despite the best intentions. Science shows us that habits are not merely the product of willpower or moral character. They are deeply influenced by context, by the subtle cues that surround us and signal what is possible, safe, or rewarding. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines, constantly scanning the environment for triggers that have historically predicted outcomes. These triggers may be as obvious as an alarm clock signaling the start of a morning routine, are as subtle as the angle of sunlight hitting a kitchen counter, a sound, a smell, or the presence of certain objects. Every habit, whether walking after lunch, reaching for a snack, or practicing mindfulness, is initiated by a context-dependent signal, and understanding this principle is the first step toward meaningful, lasting change. When we examine the way habits form, we see that repetition alone is not sufficient. It is not the number of times we perform an action but the reliability of the signal that matters most. The body and brain are constantly learning associations, connecting cues to behaviors and outcomes. If a cue reliably predicts a response, the behavior becomes automatic, requiring far less conscious effort over time. Conversely, if the context is inconsistent, if the triggers are weak or unpredictable, willpower is required to override competing impulses, and the habit is less likely to take hold. This explains why attempts at transformation often fail in environments that are not carefully structured. A person may intend to eat healthily, exercise, or meditate, but when every corner of their environment sends conflicting messages, snacks at eye level, notifications demanding attention, workspaces that encourage sitting for hours, willpower alone is insufficient to sustain change. The power of context is also evident in the subtle ways routines interconnect. Habits rarely exist in isolation. They form chains and clusters, each one reinforcing the next. A morning ritual that begins with brushing teeth can cue drinking water, stretching, or journaling because the brain learns the sequence is a predictable pattern. Similarly, placing a pair of running shoes by the door can act as a visual trigger, signaling readiness for movement. These environmental cues work quietly, behind the scenes, shaping behavior in ways that feel effortless when aligned correctly, but draining when absent or inconsistent. The science behind this is rooted in associative learning, the principle that behaviors become encoded as responses to stimuli through repeated experience. By carefully designing the signals around us, we essentially program the brain to act in ways that support our goals without requiring constant mental exertion. Habits are also influenced by social context. Humans are inherently social beings, and the presence or absence of others subtly signals acceptable behavior. Neuroscience has shown that social cues activate mirror neurons, priming us to adopt behaviors observed in those around us. This is why communities, accountability partners, and supportive environments have such a profound impact on habit formation. A gym partner, a friend who shares healthy meals, or even an online community can provide cues that reinforce desired behaviors, making them more likely to become automatic. Conversely, negative or distracting social environments can override individual intentions, forcing reliance on willpower alone, which is inevitably limited. By acknowledging that habits are context-dependent rather than purely willpower-dependent, we open a new pathway to sustainable change. It is not a matter of forcing oneself to act harder or longer. It is a matter of arranging cues, spaces, routines, and relationships so that behavior aligns naturally with our intentions. Subtle adjustments, reorganizing a kitchen, adjusting lighting to match energy cycles, pairing desirable behaviors with enjoyable sensory triggers, can shift the probability of action dramatically. The brain, attuned to patterns and predictions, responds more readily to these signals than to raw exertion of self-control. Over time, the effort of repeated decision-making fades, replaced by smooth, almost effortless movement along the pathways that context has prepared. Every moment, our bodies are speaking to us through signals that are at once subtle and profound. Hunger, fatigue, stress, thirst, and even fleeting shifts in mood are not random occurrences. They are coded messages, the language of our biology attempting to guide us toward balance, energy, and survival. Yet, in modern life, we often misinterpret or ignore these signals, treating them as obstacles, nuisances, or weaknesses instead of invitations to understanding. The sensation of hunger may be confused with thirst, the fog of fatigue misread as laziness, and the tightness of stress misperceived as a call for distraction rather than reflection. When we respond to these signals inaccurately, we engage in behaviors that may temporarily soothe discomfort but ultimately deepen imbalance. Scientific research increasingly supports the idea that the ability to sense and respond appropriately to these internal cues is central to health, resilience, and sustainable change, far more than reliance on willpower alone. The hunger signal, for example, is a complex interplay of hormones such as ghrelin, which stimulates appetite, and leptin, which signals satiety. These hormones fluctuate not simply according to calorie needs but in response to circadian rhythms, stress levels, and prior food intake. When we ignore hunger cues or suppress them with distractions, the body's regulatory system can become dysregulated, leading to overeating, cravings, or energy crashes. By contrast, tuning into the rhythm of hunger allows for a natural alignment between intake and energy requirement. It teaches us not only what to eat but when to eat, creating a pattern of nourishment that is responsive rather than imposed, adaptive rather than punitive. The act of listening becomes a dialogue rather than a command, a partnership with the biological intelligence that has evolved over millennia. Fatigue offers a similarly instructive signal. The mind often interprets tiredness as a weakness or lack of discipline, pushing us to persist through exhaustion. Yet the feeling of weariness is a message from the nervous system, reflecting energy depletion, neural load, or the need for recovery. Ignoring this signal and continuing to push can impair decision-making, increase susceptibility to stress, and reduce efficiency. Conversely, when fatigue is recognized and honored, through rest, sleep, or low-intensity activity, the body replenishes neurotransmitters, repairs cellular structures, and restores metabolic balance. The signal is not an adversary to be defeated but a guidepost to optimal functioning, revealing windows of peak performance and necessary recuperation. Stress, too, operates as a signal, though it is often treated as a purely negative force. Cortisol and adrenaline, the primary hormones of stress, rise in response to perceived threats or demands. Short-term activation sharpens focus, primes the body for action, and can enhance learning. Chronic activation, however, indicates a mismatch between demands and coping resources, signaling the need for intervention, adaptation, or boundary setting. By observing physiological cues, heart rate variability, muscle tension, sleep quality, we gain insight into the cumulative burden of stress and the necessity for behavioral adjustments. Ignoring these cues leaves the system in a state of prolonged strain, but attending to them enables intelligent responses that restore equilibrium without relying on sheer determination. The refinement of signal perception is itself a skill, a practice of mindfulness grounded in biological understanding. When individuals cultivate awareness of their internal states, they become attuned to subtle fluctuations in energy, mood, and appetite. They begin to recognize patterns, such as how hydration affects hunger perception, how movement shifts stress levels, or how sleep quality modulates motivation. With this awareness, behavior becomes less about resisting impulses and more about responding appropriately to nuanced information. The effort is not expended on struggle but on observation, interpretation, and gentle adjustment. In this way, internal signals act as navigational instruments, guiding us toward choices that support well-being and reduce the need for constant self-discipline. The spaces we inhabit and the people we interact with every day exert an influence far deeper than we often realize. Our external environment is not merely a backdrop to behavior, it is an active participant in shaping physiology, mood, and decision-making. Light, temperature, noise, and even the arrangement of objects in a room send signals to the brain and body that guide attention, energy, and motivation. Consider the effect of light. Exposure to natural sunlight in the morning synchronizes circadian rhythms, regulating hormone release, body temperature, and alertness. In contrast, prolonged exposure to artificial lighting at the wrong times can confuse these signals, impairing sleep, metabolic function, and cognitive clarity. This is a reminder that biological systems are not isolated, they constantly interact with environmental inputs, interpreting them as cues for action or rest. The patterns and signals in our surroundings can either support our intentions or undermine them, often without conscious awareness. Temperature is another subtle yet powerful influencer. The body's metabolic rate, hormone balance, and even appetite are affected by ambient temperature. Cold exposure can stimulate metabolic activity and alertness, whereas excessive heat can induce fatigue and lethargy. In essence, the environment modulates readiness for action and informs the energy state of the organism. By curating spaces that provide optimal temperature, lighting, and comfort, we create conditions in which the body's natural signals align more effectively with desired behavior. It is not about forcing change through willpower but shaping context so that our biology works in harmony with our goals rather than in opposition. Noise and auditory stimuli are equally influential. Chronic exposure to discordant or high-decibel sound increases stress hormones and impairs concentration, subtly shifting behavior toward reactive rather than reflective choices. Conversely, Gentle, rhythmic sounds or periods of quietude allow the nervous system to reset, improve focus, and enhance the capacity for deliberate action. The interplay between environmental noise and behavior highlights the importance of designing spaces that minimize conflicting signals and amplify cues that encourage desired outcomes. Even subtle modifications, such as background music aligned with mood or nature sounds that evoke calm, can shift energy and behavior without conscious effort. Social environment, perhaps the most profound influence, is deeply intertwined with biology. Humans are fundamentally social creatures. The presence, behavior, and expectations of others modulate hormones, neural circuits, and emotional states. Oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, is released in response to social connection, promoting cooperation, empathy, and trust. Conversely, isolation or exposure to negative social cues can elevate stress hormones, reduce motivation, and trigger maladaptive patterns. Behavioral science demonstrates that the people we surround ourselves with act as living signals, reinforcing habits and shaping the likelihood of success or failure in our goals. By consciously choosing social contexts that align with our intentions, we harness this signaling system to support rather than resist our efforts. Even the arrangement of physical objects communicates information to the brain. Items placed at eye level or within reach become prioritized. Cluttered spaces signal chaos, increasing cognitive load and decreasing the ability to focus. Simple shifts in layout, such as keeping water on a desk to encourage hydration, placing exercise equipment in plain view, or organizing workspaces to reduce friction, can profoundly influence automatic behaviors. These cues operate below conscious awareness, guiding decision-making without requiring deliberate effort. Small adjustments compound over time, creating an environment that nudges behavior in the direction of health, focus, and well-being. In essence, the external environment is a rich source of information that continuously shapes internal states and responses. When we curate surroundings, light, temperature, sound, social interactions, and physical layout, we create an ecosystem of signals that supports the body's natural tendencies rather than relying on finite reserves of willpower. Change becomes less about resisting impulses and more about aligning ourselves with a context that speaks the language of our biology, fostering behaviors that feel natural, sustainable, and effortless. Self-awareness is often spoken of as a philosophical ideal, a form of introspection or mindfulness, yet it has profound biological and psychological roots that shape behavior and health in measurable ways. At its core, self-awareness is the ability to observe and interpret internal and external signals without immediate judgment, to recognize patterns in our thoughts, emotions, and physical states, and to act from understanding rather than compulsion. It functions as a meta-signal, a higher-order system that allows us to monitor the messages sent by the body, mind, and environment, and to make choices informed by this awareness. In this sense, self-awareness becomes the mechanism through which we translate raw signals into intelligent action, reducing the need to rely on finite reserves of willpower and increasing the likelihood of sustained, adaptive behavior. Neuroscience reveals that self-awareness engages regions of the prefrontal cortex associated with executive function, decision-making, and emotional regulation. When we practice observing our thoughts, noting impulses, and recognizing bodily sensations, we are effectively strengthening these circuits. This is not about judgment or discipline, it is about tuning the brain's capacity to notice patterns that previously operated unconsciously. By developing this capacity, we become attuned to the signals that precede behaviors, such as the subtle tension in muscles indicating stress, the creeping sense of mental fatigue, or the early pangs of hunger or craving. Recognition of these cues allows us to respond proactively rather than reactively, to make choices aligned with long-term well-being rather than immediate gratification. Self-awareness also allows us to see context more clearly. Every habit, impulse, or emotional reaction arises in a specific environment, influenced by cues and signals that our brain interprets continuously. By observing how these patterns unfold, we begin to identify the triggers that shape our behavior. Perhaps a notification on a phone leads to hours of distraction, or a late-night work environment fosters unhealthy snacking. Through careful observation, we recognize these relationships and can design interventions that reduce friction and increase alignment with desired behaviors. The effort shifts from struggling against impulses to understanding the conditions in which they arise, transforming behavior from a battlefield into a dialogue with self and environment. Emotional states, 2. Are illuminated through self-awareness. Stress, anxiety, and fatigue often drive behaviors that feel automatic or uncontrollable, yet they are also messages, indicators of imbalance, unmet needs, or cognitive overload. Self-awareness allows us to differentiate between true physiological signals and the emotional interpretations that can amplify them. By naming and observing emotions without immediately acting on them, we create a pause, a space in which reason, intuition, and biology can be integrated. This pause reduces reactive behavior, diminishes the drain on willpower, and creates a pathway for intentional action rooted in understanding rather than compulsion. Furthermore, self-awareness is iterative and cumulative. The more we practice noticing signals, the more accurately we interpret them, and the more reliably we can predict outcomes. Over time, this becomes a form of internal calibration, a feedback loop that tunes perception, decision-making, and behavior to the subtle rhythms of the body and environment. Actions become less about effort and resistance and more about alignment. The brain no longer needs to mobilize enormous energy to maintain discipline because the signals themselves guide adaptive responses naturally. It is a shift from force to flow, from coercion to insight, from struggle to cooperation with the intricate intelligence inherent in our biology. In practical terms, cultivating self-awareness might mean pausing to note hunger before reaching for food, observing stress levels before reacting, or reflecting on environmental cues that influence mood and behavior. It could involve journaling, mindfulness practices, or simply taking moments throughout the day to check in with the body and mind. Each act strengthens the capacity to notice, interpret, and respond, creating a cascade of small, intelligent choices that accumulate into meaningful change. Through self-awareness, we begin to live not in constant opposition to our impulses, energy cycles, or environment, but in concert with them, harnessing signals as guides rather than fighting them with sheer willpower. If you found these insights helpful and want to continue learning practical, science-backed strategies to stay healthy, strong, and vibrant as you age, don't forget to like this video, share it with friends and family who could benefit, and subscribe to our channel for daily senior wellness tips, nutrition guidance, and simple lifestyle hacks designed to enhance longevity and quality of life. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video that can help you live healthier, happier, and more empowered every day.